Imagine being locked in a sensory deprivation tank, but while carrying the literal weight of the world, just suspended by iron spikes as your lungs, slowly collapse.
God, that is a terrifying image.
Right? Now, imagine that sensory deprivation tank isn't just a small box. It's the entire city of Jerusalem at high noon plunged into this suffocating unnatural blackness for exactly 3 hours.
3 hours of total darkness. In the middle of the day.
Exactly. It's 33 AD, the absolute height of the Passover festival, and the sun simply vanishes. But here is the massive historical paradox. Passover, by definition, always falls on the 15th of Nisan.
Which is dictated by the lunar calendar, right? So that means it's always a full moon.
Always a full moon, and a solar eclipse physically requires a new moon. Even under perfect, orbital conditions, a total eclipse lasts a maximum of about 7.5 minutes. So a 3-hour eclipse during a full moon is an absolute astronomical impossibility.
Right. The physics just flat out do not allow for it.
They don't. Yet, Roman, Greek, and Samaritan historians all recorded 3 hours of pitch blackness over Judea. I mean, the historical receipts are hiding right in plain sight. So I'll be arguing that this anomaly was a deliberate cosmic event, an engineered divine blueprint enacting the ultimate Day of Atonement.
Well, I come at it from a different angle. I will be arguing that yes, while the historical and geological records of this anomaly are undeniably substantial, we really have to be careful. We can't just conflate visceral historical trauma with, perfectly engineered theology.
But how else do you explain the sheer unnaturalness of it?
Well, the core question is what to actually do with the darkness itself. The anomaly is real, I grant you that. But does it point to a supernatural cosmic transaction, or are we looking at a profound meteorological freak event that fundamentally traumatized everyone present?
A trauma that they just backfilled with prophecy?
Exactly. A natural disaster that resulted in a massive psychological paradigm shift, which later followers then wrapped in the language of ancient Hebrew theology.
I mean, to really answer that, we have to look at those historical receipts, which are unusually robust for an ancient event. This wasn't just some localized rural rumor. It entered the imperial record.
You're talking about Thales?
Yeah, as early as 52 AD, you have the Samaritan historian Thales attempting to explain the darkness away. And then later, around 197 AD, the Christian apologist Tertullian writes his Apologeticus directly to the Roman magistrates.
Right, and he challenges them to check their own records.
He literally dares the Roman officials to go into their own state archives to verify the anomaly. You don't challenge the Roman government to check its own administrative records unless you are absolutely certain that the documentation of that 3-hour blackout is sitting right there in the imperial vaults.
See, I don't dispute the historical footprint at all. In fact, we have modern, hard data that corroborates the physical chaos of that exact window.
The Dead Sea cores, right?
Yes. In 2012, geologists from the German Research Center for Geosciences analyzed sediment cores from the Dead Sea. By looking at the varves, those are the annual layers of sediments, and the seismites, the deformed layers caused by earthquakes, they pinpointed a massive seismic event.
Right in that same window.
Definitively within the 26 to 36 AD timeframe. That is the exact window of Pontius Pilate's procuratorship. But pointing the sediment cores in Roman archives proves a natural disaster happened, not a divine ritual.
But a natural disaster doesn't explain the sky.
I'd argue it was brutal Roman execution mechanics. Hypovolemic shock and asphyxiation compounded by a sudden, terrifying natural disaster.
But relying purely on a natural disaster hypothesis completely ignores the inescapable trap of orbital mechanics. Let's go back to Thales in 52 AD. He tried to claim the event was just a routine solar eclipse.
Which we know is impossible during Passover.
Right.
And the Christian chronologist Julius Africanus caught the lie immediately. He pointed out exactly what we just established. The moon is literally on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun during a full moon.
The ancient Greeks and Babylonians were well aware of that.
Sure, Hipparchus had mapped lunar cycles with incredible precision, centuries before that.
Exactly. So non-Christian historians were desperately trying to explain away an event they knew happened, but their naturalistic explanations fundamentally violated the laws of physics.
Hold on, though. Ruling out a solar eclipse doesn't mean physics went out the window. It just means we need to look at other terrestrial phenomena, you know? The Mediterranean basin is highly volatile.
Volatile enough to black out the sun for 3 hours?
Absolutely. If we look at 44 BC, right after Julius Caesar was assassinated, the eruption of Mount Etna cast a massive pall of volcanic ash that darkened the skies for a long time.
So you're suggesting volcanic ash?
Or the Khamsin. We have to consider these massive, incredibly dense desert dust storms that sweep through the Judean region in the spring. I mean, they can drop visibility to absolute zero in minutes.
True, they are intense.
Right, so if you pair a severe Khamsin dust storm with the massive earthquake we know happened from the Dead Sea cores, you have a recipe for sudden, terrifying darkness. It has nothing to do with orbital mechanics and everything to do with local geology.
I mean, I understand the appeal of the Khamsin theory, but it completely falls apart when you examine the exact chronological precision recorded in the texts.
The timing, you mean?
Yes. All semi-synoptic Gospels independently record that the darkness began at the 6th hour, which is exactly noon, and lifted at the 9th hour, exactly 3 p.m.
Well, ancient timekeeping wasn't exactly digital.
Even so, weather simply does not run on a punch clock. A localized dust storm does not just roll in precisely as a man is nailed to a cross, hold a perfectly uniform blackness for exactly 3 hours, and then instantly dissipate the very second he dies.
You're saying the timing is too perfect.
It is. The precision of the timeline fundamentally resists natural explanations. It behaves much more like a physical barrier, a deliberate localized obstruction.
A deliberate obstruction. You're assuming a level of orchestration that the text implies, sure, but human observers at the time might have just perceived it as an eerily timed storm. When you say physical barrier, are you speaking metaphorically?
No, I'm speaking theologically, grounded in the ancient Hebrew concept of chosek.
Tangible darkness.
Exactly. In the book of Exodus, during the plagues of Egypt, the darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was described as a darkness so dense it could be felt. It was an oppressive, tangible presence.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Now apply that concept to Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. Once a year, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the nation. He disappeared behind the parashe, the massive temple veil.
Which was a massive structural barrier. Huge.
Historical sources say this veil was roughly 60 feet tall and 4 inches thick. It was so heavy, it reportedly required 300 priests just to wash it.
Right, it was meant to be this literal and symbolic barrier separating the absolute holiness of God from the mundane world.
Exactly. And the scriptures state that God dwells in thick darkness. When the high priest went behind that veil, the transaction of atonement was entirely hidden from human eyes.
So you're saying the sky became the veil?
Yes. I am arguing that those 3 hours of darkness over Jerusalem were the universe enacting this exact ritual on a cosmic scale. It was a private transaction of infinite spiritual weight, taking place in a public execution setting, but deliberately shielded by a cosmic veil.
It's an incredibly elegant theological parallel. I'll absolutely give you that. But let's step out of the library and put ourselves on the ground at Golgotha. Look at the Roman centurion in charge of the execution detail.
The one who declares him the Son of God?
Right, but think about who this guy is. He commanded 80 soldiers. To reach that rank, he had likely served 15 to 20 years in the Roman legion, seeing the absolute worst of human brutality.
He is a hardened killer.
Exactly. He is a pragmatist, a violent man who executes state enemies for a living. He knows absolutely nothing about the Jewish high priest, Yom Kippur, or the dimensions of the temple veil.
And yet, he is the very first person at the cross to break.
He breaks, yes, but why? He doesn't say, truly this man was the Son of God because he suddenly unlocked ancient Hebrew theology. He breaks because of sheer, overwhelming psychological warfare.
You think it was just the weather that scared him?
I think he was broken by the physical terror of a 3-hour midday blackout, an extreme drop in desert temperature, and violent seismic activity. It was the visceral horror of the anomaly that shattered his stoic Roman worldview.
But couldn't it be both?
Humans naturally bridge traumatic events. He experienced an inexplicable natural disaster while watching a man die, and his brain connected them. It's a psychological reaction to trauma, not a recognition of a divine ritual.
I'd argue the centurion wasn't just reacting to the geological chaos, though. He was reacting to how the victim navigated the specific mechanics of the execution during that chaos.
Navigated the execution. It's asphyxiation.
Right. We need to look closely at the physiological reality. In 1968, archaeologists in Jerusalem found the ossuary of a crucified man named Yohanan.
Ah, the heel bone artifact.
Yes. Inside, they found his heel bone with a bent 7-inch iron nail still driven through it, totally fused to a knot of olive wood. It gave us this horrifying, clinically precise understanding of how the Romans engineered this torture.
Because the victim is suspended by the wrists, which completely dislocates the shoulders and paralyzes the pectoral muscles.
Precisely. The paralysis of the chest muscles means the victim can inhale, but they literally cannot exhale.
They suffocate under their own weight.
To take a single breath or to speak a single word, Jesus had to push his entire body weight up on that pierced iron nail in his feet, scraping his lacerated back against the rough wood, just to force the diaphragm to push air out.
Every word was an agonizing transaction.
Every single syllable. And what does he do with his final breath at the end of the 3 hours? He pushes up on the nail and screams in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yes. And we know from the text that the crowd fundamentally misunderstands him. Because he's speaking Aramaic, they hear Eli and think he's delirious, calling for the ancient prophet Elijah.
Right, they think he's begging for a rescue.
But they miss the literary reference. That cry wasn't delirium. It was a deliberate, hyper-conscious breadcrumb trail. He was quoting the exact first line of Psalm 22.
The Davidic psalm.
In first-century Jewish tradition, quoting the opening line of a psalm was a standard method for invoking the entire text. And Psalm 22 was written by King David roughly 1,000 years earlier.
A millennium before crucifixion even existed.
A full millennium before the Romans even invented it. And David writes, "A company of evildoers encircles me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots."
The exact mechanics of what was happening?
Jesus is utilizing his final breath, fighting through asphyxiation, to point out a flawlessly premeditated blueprint.
See, I have to seriously challenge the intentionality there. Let's look at the medical reality of what you just described. This is a man whose body has been subjected to extreme scourging.
Yes, severe blood loss.
He is actively dying from hypovolemic shock. His blood and fluid volume has dropped so drastically that his heart can no longer pump enough blood to his organs. His brain is literally starved for oxygen.
But he still speaks.
But are we genuinely supposed to believe that a brain experiencing profound hypoxia is consciously executing a literary masterclass in 1,000-year-old poetry?
You're assuming his mind was subject only to standard biological limitations, which the entire narrative challenges.
But if we're evaluating the historical and physical evidence, the physiological reality strongly suggests otherwise. To me, it is infinitely more credible that this was a raw, agonizing cry of profound divine abandonment.
Just raw trauma.
Yes. He felt entirely forsaken in the darkness. The trauma of that moment was so overwhelming that decades later, his followers, trying to make sense of the horror, backfilled the theological connections to Psalm 22.
A coping mechanism, essentially.
Human beings cope with severe trauma by finding patterns. They survived an inexplicable geological nightmare, and they mapped their ancient texts onto the tragedy to give it meaning.
If it were just retroactive storytelling, I might agree. But the patterns weren't just literary. They were physical, and they manifested structurally in the exact moment of his death.
You mean the temple?
Let's go back to the temple veil, the massive 4-inch thick parashut. At exactly 3 p.m., the moment the darkness lifts and he dies, the Gospels record that this veil tears.
Right.
But Matthew specifically notes an engineering impossibility. It tears from top to bottom.
Human hands cannot physically tear a 60-foot woven curtain, starting from the ceiling.
Implying a force from above.
Exactly. And we don't just have to rely on the gospel accounts for this. We have stunning extra-biblical validation for a massive systemic breakdown inside the temple during this exact historical window.
You're bringing in the Talmudic anomalies from Tractate Yoma?
I absolutely am. The Jewish Talmud, compiled by rabbinic authorities who had literally zero interest in validating the Christian narrative, records a deeply unsettling series of events.
Right, starting 40 years before the temple fell.
Yes. In Tractate Yoma 39b, it states that exactly 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, terrifying anomalies began occurring in the sanctuary. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. 40 years prior places us squarely at 30 AD, the precise temporal window of the crucifixion.
And the anomalies recorded were highly specific to the daily operations of the priests.
They struck at the very heart of the sacrificial system. The massive, heavy doors of the sanctuary began violently swinging open by themselves, to the point where Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai had to verbally rebuke them.
Like a structural failure, or a spiritual one. The western lamp of the menorah, which was required to burn perpetually, inexplicably died, and priests could not keep it lit. But the most chilling detail involves the Yom Kippur scapegoat ritual.
The crimson thread.
Traditionally, a crimson thread was tied to the door of the sanctuary. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow." When the scapegoat was accepted, that crimson thread would miraculously turn white.
Signaling forgiveness.
Right. The Talmud records that starting 40 years before the temple's destruction, that crimson thread refused to ever turn white again. The entire ancient sacrificial system catastrophically short-circuited. The cosmic veil of darkness was lifted and the earthly veil was torn. Well, I will certainly concede that the socio-political and religious systems of Jerusalem suffered a total structural collapse during that window.
The historical record on that is clear.
It completely broke down.
But I argue that the system broke because the physical reality of the anomaly was too massive for the population to ignore, not because they suddenly unlocked a divine blueprint. Look at the immediate behavioral aftermath of the ruling class. Look at Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus.
They stepped forward to claim the body.
Yes, but we need to understand the absolute political gravity of that action. These men were elite members of the Sanhedrin, the very ruling religious council that had just condemned him.
They were risking everything.
By walking up to Pontius Pilate and claiming the corpse of a crucified state enemy, they were committing political suicide. They were risking their own execution for treason against Rome.
Because they knew who he was.
Or because they were utterly traumatized. The text notes that Nicodemus brings 34 kilograms of myrrh and aloes to the tomb. That is roughly 75 pounds of spices. In the first century, that exorbitant amount was reserved strictly for burying royalty.
Which perfectly aligns with the realization of the blueprint.
Or it aligns with a profound psychological shock. If you build your understanding of this event purely on a sterile theological blueprint, you really risk missing the sheer human psychology of what just occurred.
How so?
That free-hour blackout completely rewired the survival instincts of the Judean elite. These men went from hiding in the shadows, protecting their political status, to risking their lives in broad daylight. Why? Because whatever they physically experienced during those 3 hours, the sensory deprivation, the earthquake, the terror, convinced them that the world had fundamentally tilted on its axis.
Right. But
it doesn't require a divine ritual to change human behavior. Surviving a catastrophic anomaly is enough to alter someone's worldview forever.
But that radical psychological rewiring is exactly the proof of the blueprint. You don't abandon your entire political and social survival instinct just because the weather got strange.
It was more than just weather, it was an earthquake and an eclipse-like event.
But the sheer convergence of the evidence is what commands our attention. You have the physics of orbital mechanics, proving an eclipse was mathematically impossible. You have the Dead Sea seismic cores confirming the earthquake at that exact time.
True, the timing is remarkable.
You have Roman imperial records challenged by Tertullian, acknowledging the blackout. You have a 1,000-year-old Hebrew poem accurately describing the mechanics of a Roman execution centuries before it was invented.
The Psalm 22 connection.
And you have the Talmud itself, recording the collapse of the temple system at the exact same moment. It makes this the most precise
overdocumented, inexplicable event in ancient history.
It is certainly inexplicable.
The darkness wasn't a localized dust storm or some coincidence of geology. It was a deliberate cosmic veil. It was the universe honoring the unimaginable weight of the ultimate Day of Atonement, completely shutting down the visual spectrum so a transaction of infinite gravity could take place in the thick darkness.
And my final word on this is, whether one views it as a flawlessly executed divine blueprint, as you so thoroughly argue, or as an inexplicable historical and geological trauma that shattered the ancient world, as I find more credible, the inescapable fact remains the same.
The blackout happened.
A 3-hour blackout occurred. It fundamentally altered the psychology of every single person present on that hill. It stripped a hardened Roman veteran of his military pragmatism. It broke the self-preservation instincts of the Jewish religious elite. And it sent the mocking crowds walking back into Jerusalem, beating their chests in absolute grief. The historical anomaly is laid bare in the sediment of the earth and the ink of ancient archives, and it demands an answer.
We leave you standing in the pitch black of high noon Jerusalem. The ground has stopped shaking. The 60-foot veil is torn from the ceiling to the floor. The cosmic sensory deprivation tank has been shattered. The central question we are left with isn't merely what caused the darkness. The question is what you do with the fact that after 3 hours of suffocating wait, the light eventually returned.